Hi there, I thought I'd share a short video reflection on the scripture readings that have been suggested for churches to look at this Sunday. It's going to be the first Sunday after Christmas. It's also going to be New Year's Eve. And the scripture readings that have been suggested for this Sunday, I'm going to look at three. Normally I only look at two, but I'm going to look at three this time. And the first one is from Isaiah chapter 61, verse 10 to 62, verse 3. The epistle is from Galatians chapter 4, verse 4 to 7, so that's quite a short one. And then the gospel reading is from Luke 2, verse 22 to 40. So feel free to pause the video and have a read of those, and then get the video started up again. On Monday, I was in the city, not for the Boxing Day sales, but the Boxing Day sales were certainly on. And the Boxing Day sales, I think, were reminding us of what Christmas is really about for our society. I spent a lot of time living in the city or close to the city, and if it's really a familiar place, then you'll notice when there's lots of people who aren't very familiar with it, they'll be stopping in a group and blocking the flow of footpath traffic, and they'll be trying to get onto the tram before letting people get off, and they'll be trying to ride electric scooters around on the footpath in a crowd. It's all really annoying. You also get a lot of people being cranky because they've decided to drive in and they've found out that it's hard to get around the city in a car, especially when there's so many other drivers that are trying to drive around in the little laneways and losing their tempers with each other. I was sitting out the front of the State Library working on today's service, actually, and I saw two teenage couples, the four of them in matching outfits, sidling up to the vast herd of electric scooters that have been arrayed out on the footpath. And they'd been placed at the corner of the intersection. And I could see them trying out the scooters and thinking, do they know how to ride these safely? Are they supposed to be sharing a scooter? Shouldn't they be wearing helmets? And they'd been sharing two scooters between the four of them, with the boys at the front and the girls hanging on behind. And they all got off and they were talking amongst themselves. And I saw one of the girls turn to face the Church of Christ building across the road, and she made a sign of the cross, started speaking out in prayer for safety for them, while the other girl leant on her shoulder and listened. Then the four of them got on the two scooters and sped off down the footpath. I was wondering, as a church, as Christians in this society, do we mourn the fact that the church is no longer central to Australian society? And do we mourn the fact that most people no longer participate in church services? Or are we present and attentive in the community where people are living out their faith and witnessing to their faith in the community in normal parts of everyday life? I don't know what folks from the Church of Christ would have made of this prayer. I don't know what people watching this video would make of it. But it was a public display of a young person's faith in everyday life amongst their peers. In today's reading from the book of Isaiah, we have a vision of restoration and renewal. God is restoring Israel, but also doing something new. The people had been defeated by their enemies, and many had been taken into exile in foreign countries in Assyria and Babylon. At a later time, when the nation of Persia had become the dominant power, Jewish people were allowed to return from exile to their homelands with sponsorship from the Persian king. But when these exiles returned home, they discovered that the land was still devastated by war. The city was in ruins and the temple was desecrated. And when the exiles met the Jewish people who'd remained in the land, they didn't recognize their faith or their way of life. The exiles concluded that the religion and lifestyle of the people who remained in the land must have been corrupted by their involvement with the neighboring nations. And I wonder whether the people who had stayed might have thought that the exiles were the ones who had been changed by their time among the nations in exile. I wonder whether they would have thought that their faith and their way of life might have been influenced by the support that they were receiving from the Persian Empire to rebuild the nation. In any case, there was conflict between those who had remained in the land and those who were returning with the support of Persia. In this situation of devastation and conflict, the prophet speaks a vision of restoration and renewal. As we heard Isaiah's vision, we might have remembered the imagery from the first creation story in Genesis, where God creates a garden out of the void and waste. Here again, God is making new life sprout up from the desolate earth, creating a garden. We might also remember that in the 2 creation stories that are included in Genesis, there is separation, division, splitting, but this is a creative separation. Separation creates sea and dry land. Division creates light and dark, day and night. Splitting the human creates different genders. We might remember the garden where God, humanity, and all the creatures lived in harmony. God says that what God is doing, restoring the nation to what it was, but also doing something new, is going to be a witness to all the nations. In the Gospel reading, we hear about Mary and Joseph taking their newborn baby Jesus to the temple, and his arrival being celebrated by the 2 faithful elders there. Simeon announces that having met this child, he can now die in peace, because the child is the salvation of Israel, a nation still under the power of foreign empires. And this child is a light to all the nations. But he also says to Mary that this child will bring a lot of conflict and pain. Like in the time of return from exile, the renewal of faith that Jesus brought also divided the Jewish community in painful ways, as new forms of faith sprouted and grew up, eventually becoming rabbinic Judaism and Christianity. The prophet Anna rejoices at meeting the baby Jesus, praises God because this child will redeem Israel. Redeeming means buying someone out of slavery. Both of these elders of the Jewish faith are faithful in the way of life that they've been raised in, and they can also celebrate the new thing that they see God doing in this young family who have brought their baby to the temple for the first time. In Paul's letter to the church in Galatia, he's writing to a group of non-Jewish Christians, a community that sprouted up where God has been doing a new thing among the nations. The people of Galatia may not just be foreign, they may also be considered wild, uncivilized barbarians, according to the Greek-speaking world. There have been Christians from Jerusalem who've been in touch with them as a community, telling them that in order to follow Christ, they have to become Jewish, following the Jewish dietary customs and having the men circumcised. Paul is saying to them, though, that they don't have to do all of these things to be part of the new thing that God is doing. They've been adopted into God's household as they are. They've been redeemed from slavery as they are, and they can continue to be their own unique people in God's household. I wonder, in what ways might God be restoring ancient faith now? And in what ways might God be doing something new? I think it'd be good for us to take time to consider where God might be at work around us and where we might have opportunities to participate in what God is doing.